Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to MEED Live. I hope that you are all well and that you are all staying safe. This is the 5th edition of our special series of webinars called The Impact of Covid-19 on Business in the Middle East and North Africa. The market, of course, has been turned on its head by the measures taken to prevent the spread of Covid-19, and the purpose of these webinars is to provide a regular update to people doing business in the Middle East about what is going on in the region and what are the key things to understand and to be aware of. We hope that by providing you with these regular series of interactive webinars that we can provide you with useful insights during the crisis and an opportunity to ask questions and hopefully have some of those questions answered. So thank you very much for joining us today, and please feel free throughout our conversation to submit questions to our panelists using the Q&A screen, the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Nabil. The content of the webinars comes from MEED and MEED projects, and if you are subscribers to MEED and MEED projects, you can see you can follow the content and you can find out a lot more about all of the topics that we discuss today using the links shown. Now, if you're not yet a subscriber to MEED and MEED projects, you can contact me or any of the panelists on today's broadcast and find out more information. So today, if we can go to the next slide, please, Nabil, we have quite a busy program of content. We're going to have an initial look at the impact of COVID-19 on the Middle East and North Africa, and we'll look at some case numbers and also some of the government measures taken in response to the case numbers. We will then have a look at the economic impact on the region. We will look at oil prices and how the dramatic movement in oil prices affect the outlook for the market. And then I'll hand over to Ed James, the Director of Content and Analysis at MEED Projects, who will talk about the projects market and some of the patterns and trends we are seeing there. Once Ed has finished his presentation, we will move on to look at the construction sector and then the oil and gas sector. And finally, we will go to our special focus segment, which will be looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the healthcare sector in the Middle East and North Africa. Our panel for today's broadcast, we have the full MEED team, or 6 members of the MEED team, and we're joined by a special guest, Chris Roberts, who is a global solutions architect from the healthcare segment at Schneider Electric.
Yes, just to carry on from Richard, on MEED we've been obviously covering all the updates on what's going on with the coronavirus and what's happening in the region, and we've got a daily summary which Neha and the rest of the team work on. We've also got a bi-weekly executive briefing, and on the website we've got a dedicated channel with all our the COVID output, and obviously the majority of stories these days are reflecting what's going on in terms of the impact of the virus and government's response and company responses to what's going on. So we move to the next slide. The numbers are quite interesting across the region at the moment. Iran remains the geography that's been most affected by the outbreak of the virus. The rest of the region, once the problems in Iran started to build up, locked down quite significantly. And although we've seen an increase in numbers, they've gone up to quite high levels now. The numbers haven't really ramped up in the way some people thought they could do probably 3 weeks ago. So I think that shows that the lockdown measures are working. But obviously there's still a significant challenge, and the government response really is one of getting prepared for things getting worse rather than a degree of complacency. We can move to the next slide, Nabil. Okay, as the lockdown situations continue, there's quite a lot of things happening. As I mentioned, there's a lot of preparations in place. Perhaps the most high-profile thing, which we'll come on to later, has been the development of field hospitals, and that's something which Neha and Chris will discuss in more detail later. There's also been some other interesting stories in Saudi Arabia. There's been investigations and corruption problems with the stimulus and economic aid that's been put forward to help people with the virus situation. So that's an unfortunate consequence of when there's government money being handed out or being made available. Shutdowns continuing in the UAE, which is quite a significant problem for a large part of the UAE economy, although a lot of the economy is still operating. Certainly the hospitality, food and beverage and entertainment sector has a lot of issues. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, there's a lot of contracts being reviewed, a lot of things being put on hold after it was effectively a period of holiday that was going on in Kuwait rather than a lockdown situation. In Iran, which you could argue is slightly ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the region in terms of their position with the virus, they've reopened a little bit, and people are now beginning to move out of the period that they're in the rest of the Gulf region. So that's a slightly different stage of development, and it will be quite interesting to see how that progresses, just to see what other governments decide to do in terms of opening up and the risk of reinfection and things like that. Egypt, again, Egypt has a different challenge to certainly the GCC countries in the fact that it's a very populated country. So that there's measures coming in to control things there. And in Iraq, which has had significant problems as well, there's talk of reopening some things as well. So we then move to the next slide.
If I can jump back in, Colin, I don't know if you can hear me. I apologise for the technical disruption. Thank you for stepping in. This slide here, I wanted Indrajit to pass a few comments. We've seen these massive movements in the oil markets this week, and particularly in America when we saw the WTI drop to negative prices. You know, people giving money to buyers to take oil off their hands. And in this region today, we've seen Brent crude fall to $17.50 a barrel, which is the lowest in 2 decades. Indrajit, what's going on?
And to that, just to add to that fact, basically OPEC has had an emergency sort of informal discussion last night to take stock of the whole oil market situation. And there is speculation that the OPEC plus output cut agreement that is to come into force from 1st of May could be brought a little forward as well in the last week of April. But anyway, hello to everyone listening in. Yeah, I mean, the WTI story has been quite phenomenal. I mean, it's unprecedented by every account. Obviously, between 20th and 21st April is when this historic collapse took place. Obviously, there are a few technicalities that explains this. Firstly, obviously, there's the factor of oversaturation of crude storage spaces in America, as well as the rest of the world. In fact, just as I was coming onto this webinar, someone has shared a map that shows where the VLCCs, the very large crude carriers, are currently parked and where they're floating. So Brent's not too far away in terms of facing this.
If I can just ask a question, just a quick question. So I find it very difficult to understand what was going on with how can you have negative oil prices in America? I didn't get it. And I understand it's futures contract and it was storage capacity was full, and that we had this unique sort of aberration where we had this deadline for May trades. But what's the connection? Is there a connection with Brent crude? The falls that we've seen in Brent, which are the oil that affect our region, is that just about supply and demand? That's not connected with the storage problems in America?
No, I think this is a question that has baffled almost everyone who's tracking the oil market. So basically, it's obviously the main factor has got to do with storage. I mean, WTI or any North American crude grade is basically connected to physical storage. You need to have physical storage spaces to be able to store the produce that shale oil producers in states of Texas and Louisiana produce. Brent has a certain advantage in that regard, in the sense that it can be stored on land as well as offshore in crude tankers and VLCCs. Which is what explains the price differential between the two benchmarks, WTI and Brent. Obviously, but with...
So just to cut sort of in, we don't expect to see the same kind of negative pricing in the Brent market. We're seeing a fall in prices because everyone's uncertain, there's too much supply, and the oil cuts that were agreed last week, they haven't yet kicked in.
Yeah.
So we're not expecting to see negative prices in Brent crude, are we? But are we at a low point, do you think, $17 a barrel, or is it going to go down further?
I think earlier today in early hours of trading, Brent actually dropped to under $15 a barrel. So I don't think we haven't yet reached the lowest point. Obviously, Brent slipping under the $10 a barrel mark is unlikely, but you never know. I mean, with so much of overproduction currently, and there's such a huge amount of global glut at the moment. Nothing can.
Okay, but what the production cuts that were agreed then with OPEC and the other producers last week, those will kick in May. So that's when we'll start to see the kind of longer term stabilization impact.
You still have to factor in the first week of May, because obviously the agreement comes into place from 1st May. So the first week's obviously been
Brilliant, thank you very much. So if we just scoot on to the next slide, Nabil, just quickly want to look at the impact of these low oil prices. So this is the IMF latest forecast. We touched on it in last week's webinar. These are the GDP growth figures for the countries across the Middle East and North Africa. And you can see they're all negative in 2020. We're seeing a contraction with the exception of Egypt, but that's still about 4% below what Egypt was projected to be expanding at the start of the year. We can see Lebanon, 12% contraction. Lebanon's got its own liquidity problems and financial crisis at the moment. And Iran also 6% contraction, it's facing sanctions. But the important ones, or the biggest ones for our market, the UAE 3.5%, Saudi Arabia minus 2.3%. So within the GCC, the markets are all shrinking this year between 1 and 4.5%, according to the IMF, and that's if we get an improvement in the case numbers in the second quarter. So that's the direct impact. If we go to the next slide, we can see the impact on balance sheets, bank fiscal balance sheets. If we look at Iraq there, a fiscal deficit of 22.3% as a percentage of GDP in 2020. Iraq heavily dependent on oil. But across the board, you can see there pretty much every market, Saudi Arabia 12%, 12.6% deficit, UAE 11.1% deficit. The point of these two slides really is that the oil price falls that Indrajit just described, they're going to hit growth projections and they're going to hit fiscal deficits. You know, the governments are going to have to spend more money than they're earning in 2020 just to keep moving. If we can move to the next slide, please. The important question is, so how are the governments going to respond? And this week on MEED, we've had these two stories. There are other stories, of course, which give us some idea of how the governments are going to respond to this impairment on their income. So if I could ask Colin, who's MEED's deputy editor and follows this stuff daily, can you give us a brief summary of what these stories tell us, Colin, about the regional response to these lower oil prices?
Yeah, several countries across the region, not just Saudi Arabia, also the UAE, have been raising debt to try and get some additional money to cover their deficit. So that will support the spending that they need to do. So that's on the one side. I think it's important just to say that that's not something that's new. I mean, Saudi Arabia's been going to the debt markets quite a lot over the last few years. Abu Dhabi has last year as well, and the same with other countries. Kuwait also has been looking at it as well. So that's not something that's new. What has happened is that's there's more pressure to do that now because there is potentially a greater spending requirement. So that's just an ongoing trend as far as I'm concerned. What I think is a bit more interesting in terms of a direction of travel is the spending cuts. Over the last 2 to 3 years, we'd emerged from a sort of period of austerity, which had come in from low oil prices in 2015, 16 and 17. Then 2018 and 19, you saw governments starting to sort of approve expansionary budgets and try and get a bit of, trying to encourage economic growth. That seems to have been put on the back burner, certainly for 2020, as they're facing an immediate crisis in terms of health. So what's happening in terms of spending is spending cuts are coming through onto capital expenditure. And the statements from the government in Bahrain were really quite explicit about this. They said, look, we're going to cut construction spending and use that money for spending on healthcare and dealing with the virus situation. And I think you'll see that carrying on across the region. Really, is it's very much a dealing with a health crisis situation in 2020, and then maybe looking at obviously depending on how events unfold, looking at then what you do with your spending in 2021 in terms of whether you'll return to a capital expenditure position or more sort of a dealing with a virus situation.
I've got a question that has come in here, Colin, just whilst you're talking. The previous two slides, we were using IMF data. IMF published its World Economic Outlook last week, and not everyone agrees with the IMF outlook. And one of the questions is, the IMF GDP growth figures look incredible given the dual impact of COVID-19 and the oil price. What I take the question to mean is they're a bit optimistic. How should we use those IMF numbers?
I mean, in my opinion, there's no question that there's going to be dented growth around the world. I mean, it's quite an easy thing to use what's going on at the moment to really support almost whatever narrative you want. So I think in some ways it's easy to say that what's going on at the moment exposes the fact that the region's still dependent on oil and gas because the oil price has gone down. But frankly, I think you'll see every economy in the world, no matter how diversified they are or how dependent they are on whatever sectors, is very badly hit by what's going on with this shutdown. So I think my general feeling is that things are everywhere is going to be shut down quite significantly. I think perhaps the more important thing to think about at the moment is not so much the dip in GDP growth this year, but whether countries have got the ability to get from January this year to January next year, and whether they've got the ability to raise money, whether they've got the reserves to support what they're doing. And I think that certainly a lot of countries in the Middle East, particularly the GCC oil exporters, do have that option. Other countries in the Middle East that don't have that option. So I think that's how you would, for me, that's the more important metric in looking at the health of the region at the moment, because frankly, growth's going to be very negative around the world at the moment. We're in survival mode. So what are your reserves and what's your ability to raise debt?
Now, one other quick question that's come in. On the slide in front of us, you have the story from MEED about Bahrain cutting its spending plans for 2020. There's a question here about Saudi, UAE, and Kuwait providing support to Bahrain. We saw in 2015, after the oil price slump, that the Gulf Development Fund, which involved those three, Saudi, UAE, and Kuwait, provided a lot of support funding to Bahrain. Do we expect to see that? Has there been anything discussed or reported?
Hasn't been discussed, hasn't been reported, but I think the general assumption is that Bahrain will continue to be supported. An interesting question is how much it will be supported going forward. I think the ability of different countries to support it when they're dealing with their own problems will be diminished. So I think that will make it a little bit more difficult for Bahrain. And I think Bahrain's already had to make some tough choices over the last 12 months as they did get that debt relief package, but that's forced them to do a lot of things that are difficult. They've had to cut their public sector. They've had to offer early retirement for a lot of people. So they've been used to making some tough choices in Bahrain over the last 12 months before this virus situation. Yeah. And I think that will continue.
Okay, and we've had one observation from one of the viewers, and I think, Colin, you've written this in MEED recently that the IMF real GDP growth figures, they capture the higher output but not of oil, but not the lower prices. And the money GDP in leading oil exporting nations will fall more sharply than the real GDP figures suggest because of the oil price slump. So that's a comment you've made before, and one of our viewers is making that comment as well. Okay, now we've had a question here about how is all of this, we've just sort of touched on the macroeconomic and oil price picture, how is this going to affect the projects market? And it's a perfect question because we have on the line, I hope, Ed James, the Director of Content and Analysis at MEED Projects, and Ed has got some slides on the outlook for the projects market. So if we can go to the next slide, and perhaps if I can hand over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Richard. Afternoon, everyone. So just a few quick slides looking at the current situation with regards to project spending in the GCC and the wider MENA region. Last week, I touched on first quarter contract awards and how they were comparing year on year. Today, since we're more than halfway through April, I thought it'd be useful just to look at comparison of spending so far this month with other Aprils in the preceding 4 years. And as you can see, it's a bit of a mixed bag here. We have the UAE and Saudi Arabia pretty much level with spending in April 2019, 18 and 17. Whereas in other markets like Qatar and Kuwait, we haven't seen any spending or any contract awards so far this month. Now, of course, we're not finished yet with the month, and these could change. And it may or may not be the most accurate way of looking at spending, because, of course, you can have an award on the 1st of May rather than the 30th of April, and that will go into May numbers. But nonetheless, it's indicative of the fact that money is still being spent. Projects are still being awarded. In fact, actually last week, we saw a $1.8 billion contract awarded in Abu Dhabi for an innovation hub. So work is continuing at various paces. There is still some tendering going on. Some bids are being submitted, some tenders are being issued, but of course, it's still fairly early days, and we'll have to wait a few months before when the crisis is clear to evaluate what's really happened in the market. But currently on an indicative level, we still have spending. If we can go to the next slide. Now, since we've got a healthcare theme today, I thought we're good to look at hospital projects under construction in the GCC. And this data is taken from MEED Projects, the project tracking service. And you can see here that there are more than $23 billion worth of hotel contracts, or hotel construction contracts rather, underway in the GCC region. By far the largest is in Saudi Arabia. We've got more than $11 billion of hospitals under construction. Not really a surprise that Saudi Arabia is the largest market for healthcare. It has the largest economy and the largest population in the GCC. So I'm not really surprised to see that it also spends the most on healthcare projects. Then we've got Kuwait, which has a large number of hospital expansions underway, and some of the biggest hospitals in the world. It has more than $4 billion of hospital contracts underway at the moment. And then the UAE with more than $2 billion. Now, of course, healthcare spending is under the spotlight right now with the Covid-19 situation. There are temporary hospitals, field hospitals being built across the region. But even before the coronavirus pandemic, you can see that the region has took healthcare very seriously. And it's a social infrastructure sector. It is probably one of the sectors which is the most protected from cuts in funding, along with education and social housing. But it just goes to show that there are a large number of projects currently underway. If we go to the next slide, and those where we'll give a few examples of some of the hospitals here. You can see across the GCC in different countries, we've got a large number of healthcare facilities under construction, ranging from the very large $2.7 billion security forces, medical complexes in Saudi Arabia, to hospital expansions in Kuwait, and university hospitals, education hospitals, and so on across the region. So healthcare under the spotlight, but we've already seen a large number of contracts awarded in the last few years, and I expect this will just accelerate project spending in the healthcare sector as the current pandemic, whether it's in the region or globally, has just raised awareness of just how important it is to have enough capacity and enough facilities and enough personnel in your healthcare sector to manage crises like these. Back to you, Richard.
Ed, thanks for that. And we'll come back to, sorry, Nabil, if you can just go back to Ed's first slide with the April contract awards data. We'll come back, Ed, to the healthcare question later on when Neha will run the second half of the show with Chris on healthcare. But on the contract awards picture, we've had a question in about Qatar. Now, on the GDP growth slide, which was a couple of slides ago, Qatar was projected to see the slowest contraction in GDP growth in 2020, about 4.5% slowdown in GDP growth because of the lower oil prices and the slower non-oil activity. Have you seen any? What's the picture you're seeing or hearing about in the Qatar projects market at the moment? Obviously, the World Cup is in a couple of years, so there's some major projects that they have to keep pushing for.
Yeah, I mean, it's despite this particular graph, the Qatar market is actually performing quite well at the moment. If you recall last week's slide on Q1 awards year on year, Qatar was actually up quite a bit on spending on this time last year. So they are ramping up activity levels in advance of the World Cup. A lot of medium-scale projects in that $50 to $200 million range, particularly on roads and drainage programs, but also just in general preparing for the World Cup. So this, as I said, this slide, I mean, it takes in 3 weeks of April data. We still have another week to go. Whether or not looking at a particular month is a particularly great way of looking at overall project spending levels is debatable, but nonetheless, I think it is indicative of what's going on. In Qatar's instance, I think it's just a case of a short-term slowdown, but certainly if we take the first 3 months of the year, it's been very positive indeed.
Yeah, if I could just add on Qatar, Ed, I think it's quite interesting what's going on at the moment, because there's obviously going to be a period of difficulty for delivery over the next few months with what's going on, and with a World Cup with what is still a fixed date, that can impact the delivery of things. So there's quite a few things that I think that are looking to move into the tender phase that people were looking to get completed ahead of the World Cup, where you're going to have to sit there and look realistically, our delivery schedule is going to be affected by this. Can we still hit that World Cup start date that we want to get ready for or not? And I think that could that may or may not have an impact on what's going on in Qatar over the next year or so. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We will come back to that. I want to move to the next slide, which it follows on from Ed's theme on projects. Nabil, if we could go to slide number, I think it's 16. It's a story from MEED.com this week that Neha has written about Saudi extending contracts in Covid-19. I think this follows on perhaps from some of Ed's points. Neha, could you give a little background on what is this story and why have you selected it for today?
Thanks, Richard. So the Saudi Ministry of Finance has decided and ordered ministries as well as government departments in the kingdom to offer extensions of contracts as well as waive penalties for any delays that are caused due to COVID-19 or the curbs that Riyadh has implemented across the country to stop the spread of the illness. The decision covers delays in execution of works, it covers delays in procurement, delivery delays, completion delays, and it's a significant move because it will come as a relief to contractors in the kingdom. We all know the government is a huge employer for construction contractors in Saudi Arabia, and it really highlights that Saudi Arabia is committed to actually ensuring the construction industry does not suffer any more disruption than it might already have due to COVID.
So last week we had a special webinar with Clyde & Co, the law firm, talking about force majeure, and it was about impossibility and being unable to fulfill your contract obligations. Obviously none of us on this call, I don't think, are lawyers, but what we're seeing in this story is the government is accepting there's a degree of force majeure facing the market, and they're unilaterally offering extensions to recognise that. Is that the sort of summary of what's going on?
They haven't called it a force majeure event, but they have said that it qualifies for the exceptional clauses that would allow government entities to delay contracts. So, as you said, I'm not a legal expert, but it does indicate that the government recognizes this will change the way construction is carried out in Saudi.
Okay, thank you. Now, before we get on to, we've had a question about the field hospitals slide that we showed earlier. Now, I know that's part of your conversation with Chris later on in healthcare, so we'll come back to that. Before we get on to the healthcare content, I want to move to Indrajit's selected story for this week. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, Indrajit, you've picked on this story from ADNOC this week. It's a strategic change in its procurement policies for consultants. Could you tell us a little bit about what the story is and then why this is important? Why have you identified it as a key story this week?
So very interesting development, actually. So obviously, the proposal to create a specialized pool of elite contractors for engineering services will not be the first such structure that ADNOC currently operates. It already has a pool of project management consultants where 8 companies currently have framework agreements. This is obviously a tender for creating a select pool for key engineering firms operating in Abu Dhabi that have the right skill sets and the capabilities and the financial wherewithal to cater to ADNOC's engineering requirements. Obviously, this will cater to the whole value chain of the engineering spectrum. So feed, detailed design, pre-feed, concept selection, all of it across the board. Currently, obviously, 15 companies have been invited, and the plan is to create 2 tiers. Obviously, the elites, or so to say, the big boys in the club will actually take up the projects that are over $200 million in value, whereas the smaller pool, the second tier, will take care of the ones that are under 200 million.
So what is the purpose of this initiative? Is this about driving down costs, procurement costs for ADNOC, or is it about just tying up the top tier contractors for their priority projects?
Obviously, there's a larger sort of motive of cost reductions. If you have a select pool of contractors of your choice that have the track record of working in your projects, you also get to do away with the whole pre-qualification process, because this is essentially the select pool that you will be tendering contracts to every time. There is a strategic trend that's emerging across the GCC. So obviously, Saudi Aramco leads the way when it comes to working with select pools. We are aware of what it does with the offshore LTA. MEED has recently reported that Aramco has implemented plans of creating a second onshore LTA pool, for which the award process is very imminent, from what I understand. Oman is similarly pushing ahead with the same project management consultants pool. Kuwait has a similar structure that they're pushing ahead with. So a larger pan-GCC trend is emerging, and going forward, I think this will be sort of the new normal.
And do you think, can we say that this is connected with the current COVID crisis, or is this a strategic direction that ADNOC and the other NOCs were going down anyway? It's not directly connected with the crisis.
There isn't a direct connection, but obviously, it'll definitely help in the post-COVID-19 era when, the oil refining margins would have been squeezed. Operators would be, sort of implementing projects with a lesser financial bandwidth. Obviously, if you do away with the whole procurement practice, the pre-qualification practice, that'll help in cost reductions in overall projects.
Now, interesting, quick final question before we move on to the healthcare segment. This is interesting because we had this in the slide and we took it out. Do we know the 15 companies that ADNOC has chosen? So
for that, I'll urge readers to actually read the story in there. Can't give everything away for free. Just background, we do know the name of the 15 companies. If you go to the link to the story is there on the screen, and the 15 are listed there. I mean, we could go through them now, but it's quite a long list. Plus, just to add to that, it's an ongoing process. So ADNOC's currently having in the teleconferences and meetings almost on a weekly basis.
Okay. So if you don't have access to the MEED subscription to see it on MEED, which you should, if you drop us an email, we could perhaps help you out for this. on the condition of a future subscription. Okay, thank you, Indrajit. That's very good. Let's move on to the next slide, Nabil. We're going to move into our special focus theme today, which is looking at the healthcare sector. Now, the healthcare sector, unlike just about every other industry, which has seen a collapse in demand as well as disruption to the supply side of the industry, the healthcare sector, of course, has seen a spike in demand for healthcare services. And the challenge for the healthcare sector has been one of surviving or keeping going, not overloading the healthcare systems with the intensive care units or the ventilators or the protective equipment. And so that is the primary reason for all the social lockdowns and the economic lockdowns to protect the healthcare system. And as we saw in one of the earlier slides, we're now seeing field hospitals, temporary facilities being developed, and hotels being converted into quarantine facilities. So there's been a massive impact on healthcare, but quite unique compared to what's going on in other sectors. And so I'm going to hand over to Neha to lead a section. But I'm delighted to say we're joined by Chris Roberts. Now, Chris is a global solutions architect at Schneider Electric. He works in the healthcare segment for Schneider, and Schneider is a huge technology company providing facilities management and building management technology, and healthcare is one of their most important segments. And Chris and Schneider Electric have been involved in a lot of the COVID-19 initiatives around the world. So we're very lucky to have Chris, and he's phoning in from somewhere in America, so it's about 5 in the morning for him at the moment. Thank you, Chris, for doing this for us. I'll hand over to Neha and Chris to just really summarize the healthcare sector, and perhaps let's get into some of the detail about the lessons that we've learned from this crisis. Neha, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Chris, for joining us. Before I come to you, in just a minute, I'd like to go over what Ed said. As he pointed out, the healthcare sector in the region was witnessing very high levels of demand and spending commitments even before the COVID-19 pandemic emerged. We've seen demand for beds consistently increasing in the Gulf region due to a variety of factors. Nabil, next slide, please. As we can see here, a couple of multi-billion-dollar projects have also been planned. They are currently in the pre-execution phase. A lot of these hospitals are in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Saudi Arabia, the major markets really for healthcare in the region. Nabil, next slide, please. So while those projects speak to the long-term sort of supply gap that we face in the GCC, in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19 and the number of infections in the region, we've seen Gulf governments responding by transforming social venues and hotels, car parks, construction, labor camps even, into field hospitals to isolate and quarantine patients of COVID-19, whether they're suspected patients or confirmed. And that's been seen as a move that has provided some respite to hotel operators as well in the GCC. I'll come to you now, Chris. Next slide, please, Nabil. Chris, thank you for joining us. What's your take on the healthcare sector's response to COVID-19 so far, both globally as well as in the region?
Yeah, thanks, Neha, and afternoon, everyone. So thanks for having us. Yeah, I think, what we've seen is, information is changing and evolving on a daily basis for us in healthcare. So we're learning every day. And I think, the capacity needs has been the big area which has kind of, changed, and what we've seen, an increase and a decrease in different areas. So Colin mentioned earlier, the numbers aren't rising as they were expected, which is great. But healthcare systems either have to preempt these numbers and think about, what are their future capacity needs, whether it's in the intensive care or whether it's just bed capacity. But then they also, when they're in the middle or during this pandemic, they need to respond very quickly. And this is where we've seen the rapid development of things like the 10 facilities, where we've seen conversion of hotels, etc. So they need to really understand, what's coming out of their models today, but they also need to be thinking long-term as to when this might come back later in the years, how they're going to respond to that incident. The other thing which has really been challenging for us is, learning about this disease and this virus. A lot of the precautions that we need to take place have changed. So initially, going all the way back to January, seems so long ago now. The initial guidance that came out of the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control, was to isolate patients in individual patient rooms. We've seen that capacity for that was not feasible, but the more that we've learned about the disease, it's not necessarily needed to have them in that level of containment. So, organizations like ASHRAE, different organizations in different regions are now coming out with different guidelines. So we need to keep up to date with these guidelines, respond to it correctly, and then find out what we need to do with things like HVAC, things like temporary powers into these areas to provide that kind of safe facility. And then kind of the last thing to really just point on this is what we have seen in healthcare is we still have other patients to care for. So what we've seen is a big shift towards telemedicine and telehealth. This has kind of been a technology which has been on the peripheral in healthcare for a while, and we've been forced into using it. And I think as we come out of this pandemic, what we'll see is a change in the way a lot of some of this, elective surgery is provided. But the big impact for health systems is what's going to come later in the year, but then also what's going to happen with their backlog of elective procedures that are still outstanding for them.
That's right. In the immediate sort of impact of COVID-19, like you pointed out, we've seen conversions of convention centers, hotels. How has that impacted those existing facilities? Because obviously a hotel is not necessarily fitted out. It doesn't have the MEP systems that you would require in a hospital. How has that dynamic worked out?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting. I mean, particularly with hotels, is if we take the US as an example, the US Army Corps came straight out and said, we're going to convert hotels. They're the ideal selected facility for us. But understanding exactly what type of patient is going to go in there, whether it's an infected patient, or whether you're quarantine a patient, has a big impact on what you need to do with your infrastructure systems. So, the initial thought was isolate them, to put in extraction fans, make negative pressure environments to kind of isolate the infection. But when we've gone into these healthcare facilities, we've said, well, if they're going to be used for quarantine purposes, do you need to really, change that infrastructure? You need to think more about, entertainment and for keeping the occupant kind of satisfied and giving them something to do while they're in that 14-day quarantine. And we've seen, in your region, where they've kind of looked at hotels as an industry which has declined. So how can we use that to help, quarantine people coming from overseas into an area? So the rapid adoption for infected patients has kind of dropped for hotels, and they've used it as more of a quarantine type of environment.
Right. And when you also consider that new facilities have been set up, so for instance, we've seen temporary field hospitals being built in the desert here in the Middle East. We've seen tent structures as well. How do you go about fitting those out in what has to be a very short amount of time to make sure that they're ready for, like you said, an infected patient or just someone that you want to isolate for suspected COVID? Yeah,
and it's a good question. I think this has been a challenge for health systems, and depending on where they are in their curve, if they're preempting it, they can think about, can they speed up some of their construction projects, which we have seen, facilities that might have been opening, end of this year or early 2021, they've actually opened up wings of those facilities to accommodate patients. So they've said, okay, we have an infrastructure that's available for us to move patients in. It might not be completely finished, but it's an environment where we can treat them. On the other side is where we're looking at things like, tent facilities, where we're looking at more triaging patients, and where we need to quickly, rapidly deploy these institutes. And this is really where we've seen the military has really kind of come to the forefront and been able to, deploy a lot of the facilities that they have existing. And then the third area is a little bit which we've been working with, different organizations, non-profit organizations, around how they can, deliver what would be shipping containers, which would contain, 2, 3, 4 bed types of facilities, which, come, fully configured and set up with, medical gas, with ventilator supplies, with electrical, with HVAC systems. So there's the kind of the three philosophies there is if we have time, we can preempt it, and we can think of structures. So that might be, new construction, hotels, etc. It's we're in the middle of this crisis. So let's think of rapid deployment of tents. Convention centers is another place where, they've just provided bed capacity. or then we can also look at how we can have kind of container solutions, which are, be a little bit more temporary, kind of permanent, depending on where we deploy them, but they can be really used to think of the now and then the longer term future.
Can I just interject with a question? Sorry, just on that subject there of the kind of modular construction that you're talking about, Chris, with the container units being used and some of the digital stuff that I guess Schneider Electric knows all about. How do you see some of the things that are happening today to provide this additional capacity changing our hospitals post-crisis? Will we go for bigger hospitals in the traditional design, or will we have the kind of this modularization component more sort of ready for off-the-shelf expansion if needed?
Yeah, I mean that's I think the dilemma that health systems are going to be in coming out of this. It's how do they make a resilient hospital without providing far too much capacity? And I think if we took if we looked at Singapore as an example, initially in this pandemic, everyone was looking to Singapore to say they've thought about it. They had the SARS incidents a lot of years ago, so they had what we call pandemic-ready healthcare facilities, where they could quickly change them into a negative pressure. But that hasn't quite helped them because their numbers have started to increase again. So it is really thinking about, do we need the scale of beds that are going to sit empty for us, or do we really need to think of a modular solution? And I think health systems have looked at these containerized solutions as a way that they can use them not just only during this crisis, but they could use them and deploy them in different areas of their countries during different types of disaster situations. So it may be something that we come out of it where they say, okay, well, let's have a reserve of these temporary types of structures where we can deploy where needed, unfortunately, when things like this happen. But I think it will be interesting is Turkey's a good example for us where we're building 4,000-6,000 bed hospitals. And to think that they could even extend that even further and have single occupancy, I mean, the construction of that and the cost is going to be astronomical in terms of what they need to invest. And do they really have the funding to put in those facilities? Or do they need to start looking at things like telehealth, telemedicine, so that they can reduce their elective bed capacity and have areas which can be kind of pandemic ready?
Thank you. Neha, sorry I interrupted there.
Right. I had a question about the flexibility that's required from regulatory bodies when you're in a situation like this, because like you pointed out, you have to transform a building and do it very quickly. What is the role that governments have played, again, both regionally as well as in other parts of the world, in terms of sort of expediting these transformations, making sure the buildings are ready?
So we've seen, things like the Joint Commission International have pended all of their inspections. So, they've said, okay, we're going to have a lot more flexibility about doing this. I think first and foremost, it's about, treating the patients. And then they're going to come back and look at, how we've done it in a safe manner. That's not to say that they're mitigating all of their safety measures. I think, we need to be really careful about that when we're doing these structures, is that we're still doing it in accordance with the guidelines, people like ASHRAE, like the IEC and the electrical regulations. So we need to make sure that we're following them and we're not responding too quickly, that we're putting patients and staff in danger. But we have seen regulatory bodies have kind of been a lot more flexible around what we can deploy. And a good example of that's around the medical equipment, ventilators, etc., where we've seen the rapid deployment, but also things around UPS systems that need to work with these. We don't necessarily have the right electrical network and the backup systems in place for all of the hospital. So we can now start to deploy, typically UPSs that might not be associated with these devices, just so that we can get capacity and usage.
Right. Cool. Richard, did you have any questions from our viewers for Chris?
Well, there was one question that came in. It seems to have been taken off again, and it was more to do with, and maybe this is not for Chris, it's more for maybe some of the MEED people, but it's about how we see the healthcare market changing around financing and issues, the private health insurance sector. Maybe Neha or Colin, you've perhaps looked at this as journalists. and Chris, obviously you feel free to step in as well, but how do we see that kind of commercial or business environment changing in healthcare? Have you had a look at this, Neha?
From the interactions I've had with the construction sector, I don't think there are many contractors out there hoping that we'll see more hospital projects being tendered once COVID is over. I don't think they necessarily perceive it as an opportunity, and this has a lot to do with, as we discussed, healthcare is already a priority in the region. So it's not like, you know, we're going to see more hospitals emerging suddenly because COVID occurred. It's important to bear in mind that COVID is a temporary blip, so to speak, in the government budgets around the region, and all the construction and fit out work that we're seeing in terms of field hospitals or converting existing facilities is temporary in nature. So how investment might move, I would hope that it will not change. I believe governments will continue to invest in healthcare projects as they have planned to. We might see more private sector involvement if liquidity continues to be a challenge in the region. But I don't think we'll necessarily...
On that point, Neha, I wonder if I can come to Chris. So obviously the PPP is a thing that people in the Middle East and North Africa have been talking about for a long time. It hasn't really succeeded outside of the electricity sector yet. It's beginning to pick up in water and wastewater, but hospital PPPs is a thing that outside this region that's quite established. And from what Chris was just saying, talking about the modular elements and things, Chris, do you see, and I apologize if this is not really your area, but do you see that this being, you know, given the financial pressures on the governments, that we could see an acceleration of perhaps private investments in PPP type hospital projects?
I mean, I think we will. I mean, I think we will. I think we do see it in other regions. You know, we've seen it in the UK. We've seen it in, you know, in North America and Canada. You know, we're seeing it in South America. Turkey is obviously, you know, a big PPP country for us. So I think we will see it, because I think the health systems and governments are, you know, they're going to be cash short. You know, the stimulus packages that are coming out, and they're going to need private support to be able to both support the private sector, but also to support, you know, what they need to do in terms of the investments in their systems.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is one that I'm sure that you will not be able to answer, so anyone can step in. If we can't answer questions, please, everybody feel free to say we can't answer them, but do we expect to see a rise in local drug production capacity, pharmaceutical production, to augment existing capacities? Now, maybe, Chris, you know about this outside of the region. I don't know, has there been any kind of increased investment in pharma production to, you know, to respond? Or Colin, maybe you've had some knowledge of this.
I personally haven't got any information on that, sorry.
Okay. All right, maybe that's one we'll have to come back to in another episode. We've got about 5 minutes left. I think what we'll do is we'll bring the healthcare segment to a close, because we have a couple of other questions that have come in that I want to touch on before we get to the end of the program. So, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Please stay on the line just for a few minutes, and if other questions come in, but I really appreciate you getting up so early in the morning to give us your time. And Neha, thank you very much for running that section. Colin, we've had 4 questions have come in today about the currency situation, the dollar peg for the regional currencies and the pressure on that peg from the current situation. We always get this question when we have instability or uncertainty in the region. What's your view on the currency peg to the dollar in the GCC?
Yeah, as always, a period of uncertainty, the question will come up again. I think it will be strained, obviously, with oil prices where they are as well. I might be wrong, but I personally don't think they'll address the situation at the moment. I think that people who are making policy decisions will say that this is a temporary situation. We don't want to make a long-term decision from a temporary point of view. So I don't think they will change it, but for sure the question will hang around for a while.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. It would be a very unlikely for them to make such a big decision on a knee-jerk reaction, I think.
Yeah, and I think again, I might be wrong here, but if you read the signals that are coming out from governments, I certainly get the impression that there's a long game being played at the moment. I think, yes, there's an awful lot of effort going into short-term things. So as we were just discussing, field hospitals and all that kind of thing. But I think it's a long game that people are playing at the moment. I think I don't think that would support some of the long-term ambitions that different governments have.
Okay. Now we've got one question for Chris. Thank you for staying on the line. So this is to you. So it says, regional governments are gradually channeling patients to the private healthcare sector as the outbreak evolves. From what you have seen globally, in regions where there have been earlier outbreak curves, how do profit margins on testing and hospitalization compare with regular diagnostics and ICU businesses? So there's probably quite a lot in that question that I don't understand, but does it make sense to you, and can you get to it?
I think I'd probably have to come back to you on an answer with that one. I don't think I could give you an answer today.
Okay. Are you seeing the way governments are responding and working with the private sector? Is it following the same pattern everywhere, and we're kind of the governments are channeling patients to private providers, or does that vary quite a lot, the approach?
It varies on the country. It varies on the country, and how much private systems are in those countries. But I think they've both governments. If you take the US as an example, so very large government system in the VA hospitals, and then a very wide private sector, and they've been working hand in hand. So they've both been sharing patients. There's been no issues with things like insurance costs. For any patients, all the co-pays, all the costs have been absorbed by the government. So effectively, government entities have socialized care for this, and then they've just used whatever hospitals are available. There's been no discrimination between public and private. Okay.
Thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of the session. Nabil, if we can go back to the slide deck, there's a couple of final closing slides I just want to run through. So for people interested particularly in the projects market, Ed James has been working over the past couple of months on a series of country by country project outlook reports, and on the right hand of this slide you can see a MENA project report. So for those of you interested in particular segments or countries and the projects market, if you go to that link that's on the right hand side there, you'll find that the reports that Ed has been producing along with this one are available there. And on the right hand side, we've just published a coronavirus update of our Saudi Arabia 2020 market report, which you can see on the left hand side of your screen. So these are just out from MEED Insights and from our research team, for those of you who want to get into the more sort of granular analytics of each market. And I think that brings us to the end. If we can just go to the final slide, please, Nabil. So this is a weekly webinar we're doing. That we know there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and we're trying to provide some weekly insights. We've been very lucky to have Chris Roberts from Schneider Electric joining us this week to talk about healthcare. Thank you to Chris, and thank you to Schneider Electric for coming to us for this conversation. If any of you out there also are interested in sort of getting involved in the conversation, please contact either myself or Ed, and you can see our email addresses on the screen in front of you. We want to try and identify the key topics and the areas of uncertainty and pain that you as our audience want to know about and that we might be able to help you with. So please don't hesitate to drop us a line and perhaps suggest some topics that you would like us to cover, and even put forward yourself or your colleagues as panelists for those topics. And I think that brings us to the end. So once again, thank you to Chris, thank you to Schneider, thank you to the MEED team and the MEED projects team for their time today. And most important of all, thank you to you for joining us, for submitting your questions. Hopefully we will see you next week. And in the meantime, stay safe. Thank you very much.